Petty Officer Daiichi Nakamura stood under the pale sun of the American Midwest, holding a bar of chocolate in one hand and a comic book in the other. His face was a mask of utter bewilderment. He stared at the items, purchased with coupons he earned by working for his enemy. The wrapper of the chocolate was bright and crinkled in his trembling hand, a sound so alien in a place he expected only to find death. He thought of the stories he was told, of the brutal end that awaited any soldier of the Emperor captured by the Americans. He expected beatings, starvation, and execution, not this, not the choice between candy and cigarettes. Was this some elaborate form of psychological torture, a way to break his spirit more completely than any physical abuse could? Or was it possible that everything he had been taught about the enemy and about honor itself was wrong? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The world had once been a coherent, ordered place defined by duty and the divine will of the Emperor. Now, it was a nightmare of fire, screaming metal, and the icy grip of the ocean. The memory was a brand on his soul, a constant roaring echo in the quiet of his mind. One moment, he was Petty Officer Daiichi Nakamura of the Imperial Japanese Navy, his feet planted firmly on the steel deck of the destroyer Akikaze. The next, he was just a man, drowning. The American torpedo had struck them amidships, a cataclysmic blow that tore the vessel in half as if it were made of paper. The deck buckled beneath him, throwing him into a sky suddenly filled with black smoke and the terrible beauty of arcing flames. He remembered the shriek of twisting steel, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the universe, followed by the concussive blast that sent a wall of water and debris across the deck. A piece of shrapnel, white-hot and vicious, had sliced through the flesh of his upper arm before he was flung into the churning Pacific. The cold was the first shock, a brutal, paralyzing force that stole his breath and turned his limbs to lead. The second was the chaos. All around him, the sea was a graveyard of his comrades, men he had shared meals with, men whose families he knew from letters and photographs, now floated lifelessly in the oily water or cried out for a salvation that would never come. He saw the ship stern, proud, and defiant only moments before, slip beneath the waves with a final gurgling sigh. Adrift among the splintered wood and the dead, Daiichi resigned himself to his fate. The Bushido code was clear. Capture was the ultimate dishonor, a stain upon one's name and family that could never be cleansed. Death in battle or by one's own hand was the only honorable path. He had lost his sidearm in the explosion, so he would have to let the ocean claim him. He closed his eyes, picturing his mother's face, and prepared to join his ancestors. But the enemy had other plans. A shape loomed out of the smoke, a gray hull that was impossibly large. An American vessel, hands strong and insistent, grabbed the collar of his tattered uniform and hauled him from the water's embrace. He landed with a thud on the hard deck, coughing up salt water, his body a symphony of pain. His training, his very instinct, screamed at him. He was a soldier of the Emperor. He would not be taken. Weak and disoriented, his hand scrabbled at his hip for the sidearm that wasn't there, a futile gesture of defiance. He looked up, expecting a boot, a rifle butt, a final contemptuous end. Instead, he saw a face. It belonged to a large American sailor, a giant of a man with shoulders as wide as a doorway and a beard the color of rust. But his eyes held no malice. They were surprisingly gentle, filled with something that looked like pity. The sailor said something in his alien tongue, the words a meaningless rumble, but the tone was unmistakable. It was not threatening. The man then draped a coarse wool blanket over Daiichi's shivering shoulders and pushed a metal canteen into his hand. Daiichi stared at it, uncomprehending. Fresh water. From the enemy. Soon after, a ship's medic, a younger man with a serious expression, knelt beside him. He cut away the shredded fabric of Daiichi's uniform sleeve, his movements efficient and detached. Daiichi braced for the searing pain of rough treatment, but it never came. The medic cleaned the shrapnel wound with a stinging antiseptic and bandaged it tightly, his touch firm but not cruel. Throughout the ordeal, Daiichi remained rigid, a statue of shame and confusion. He was not being treated as a monster, a fanatic to be exterminated. He was being treated as an injured man. This unexpected mercy was more disorienting than the violence of the battle. It was the first crack in the foundation of his world. After a period on the ship that felt both like an eternity and a fleeting moment, Daiichi and the other handful of survivors were transported to the United States. The journey was a long, surreal procession through an alien world. They were put on a train, its windows barred but offering a panoramic view of a country whose sheer scale was an assault on the senses. For days, they watched a vast, unending landscape of impossible green roll by. The fields were larger than any he had ever seen in Japan, stretching to the horizon under a sky that seemed wider and bluer than his own. They passed through small towns with neat wooden houses and strange, boxy automobiles, places that seemed untouched by the global inferno that had consumed his own life. The other prisoners were mostly silent, each man locked in his own private world of disgrace and uncertainty. They arrived at last at a place called Camp McCoy, a sprawling prisoner of war camp in the middle of Wisconsin. As they were marched through the main gates, under the watchful eyes of armed guards in tall wooden towers, Daiichi felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in his stomach. This was it. The pleasantries were over. Here, in this isolated cage, the true nature of the enemy would be revealed. The camp was a city of barracks, laid out in a precise military grid and surrounded by high fences topped with cruel coils of barbed wire. It was a prison, without a doubt, yet it was clean. The grounds were tidy, the buildings orderly. It lacked the squalor and oppressive filth he had been taught to expect from his captors. The processing began immediately. A stern-faced American officer, a captain with cold blue eyes and a jaw set like granite, observed them silently as a translator barked orders. This was Captain Albright, the camp commandant, a man whose presence radiated an unnerving authority. They were ordered to strip for delousing, a humiliating procedure that left them feeling naked and exposed, their last vestiges of military identity washed away with the harsh-smelling chemicals. Then came the medical examinations. Daiichi found himself in front of an American doctor, a man with weary eyes and methodical hands. The doctor inspected his bandaged arm, unwrapping it with care. He probed the healing wound, his touch professional and impersonal. He spoke a few quiet words to the translator standing nearby. The translator turned to Daiichi, his expression unreadable. "He says the wound is clean," the translator relayed in clipped Japanese. "You will not lose the arm." Daiichi could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. He had been so certain he would be maimed, left to rot. The doctor's simple professional assessment was another drop of water on the stone of his certainty. Throughout this process, Daiichi's disorientation deepened. He felt a constant gnawing dishonor, a shame so profound he could not bring himself to meet the eyes of his fellow prisoners. They were all adrift in this collective disgrace, their uniforms gone, their purpose erased. He was a soldier, and a soldier's eye is always working. He automatically noted the guard tower placements, the patrol routines, the angles of fire. But that part of him felt distant, a ghost of a former self. The man who now inhabited his body was simply a lost, confused soul, thousands of miles from everything he had ever known, a prisoner of an enemy who refused to act like one. The days settled into a grim routine. The prisoners were put to work. Some were assigned to logging crews, their axes ringing out in the dense Wisconsin forests. Others were sent to local farms, their backs bending to tasks they had never imagined. Daiichi's group was tasked with clearing a wide swath of land, preparing it for a new farm field. They worked under the watchful eyes of armed guards, the sun beating down on their necks. Every swing of the pickaxe, every shovelful of earth was a reminder of their fallen state. They were tools of their enemy, building the very nation they had sworn to destroy. They worked with a grim, silent determination, expecting harsh punishment for the slightest infraction, a moment of rest, a word spoken out of turn. But the punishment never came. The guards were distant figures, observing more than commanding. One of them, a young corporal named Henderson, was different. He was barely a man, with a face that still held the softness of youth. He didn't shout. On one occasion, seeing a prisoner struggling to use a long-handled American shovel, Henderson had walked over, taken the tool, and demonstrated a more efficient way to leverage it, a simple, wordless lesson in body mechanics. Then he had walked away. The gesture was so small, so mundane, yet it lodged in Daiichi's mind. After a week of this hard, monotonous labor, the prisoners were assembled in the main compound. Captain Albright stood before them, his posture as rigid as the flagpoles behind him. The translator stood at his side. A nervous energy rippled through the assembled men. This was it. A new set of rules, a new regime of punishment. Albright spoke, his English words sharp and clear, and the translator's voice followed, turning the alien sounds into a message that would shatter their reality. "You are prisoners of war," the translator announced, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "but under the Articles of the Geneva Convention, you will be compensated for your labor." He paused, letting the words hang in the still air. A confused murmur spread through the ranks. Compensated. The word made no sense. "For each day of work," the translator continued, holding up a small, thin booklet of perforated paper, "you will be paid 80 cents in canteen scrip." Daiichi stared, uncomprehending. He felt a whisper of movement beside him and turned to see his friend, Kenji, his face a mask of disbelief. The concept was so profoundly alien, so completely outside their experience and ideology, that it felt like a hallucination. In their world, prisoners were tools or obstacles, to be used until they broke or were simply eliminated. To be paid, even in some form of fake money, was an absurdity. It had to be a trap. It had to be a mockery. "A trick," Daiichi whispered to Kenji, his voice hoarse. "It must be a trick to mock us." Kenji's eyes were wide with suspicion. "Or the food in their canteen is poisoned," he whispered back. "We must not touch it. We must not use this paper." The announcement was met with a stunned, absolute silence, which slowly gave way to a ripple of incredulous murmurs. Daiichi looked at the small coupon book the translator was holding up. It was printed on cheap paper, looking like a child's plaything, a ridiculous counterpoint to the grim reality of war and imprisonment. A surge of suspicion, even stronger than his fear, washed over him. This wasn't mercy. This was a new, more insidious form of warfare, a psychological poison designed to corrode their souls. He was sure of it. For days, the small, perforated booklets of scrip lay untouched in the barracks like cursed artifacts. They were a source of constant whispered debate, a tangible symbol of the Americans' incomprehensible ways. The prisoners would gather in small, anxious clusters after the day's labor, their conversations circling the same drain of suspicion. To accept the coupons was to participate in the enemy's game, a game whose rules they could not fathom. To refuse them was to maintain a sliver of control. A stubborn rejection of the psychological manipulation they all felt was at play. The paper itself felt wrong in their hands, too flimsy to represent the sweat and ache of their work. It was a ghost of money, a mockery of commerce, in a world where the only true currency was survival. Finally, the tension was broken by a young prisoner named Haruto. He was barely a man, with wide, haunted eyes and a frame that had not yet filled out with muscle. The war had stolen his youth, replacing it with a desperate, gnawing hunger for any small comfort, any reminder of a life that was not defined by loss and labor. He could not stand the suspense, the endless paranoid speculation. One evening, his voice cutting through the weary murmurs of the barracks, he declared he was going to the canteen. He held up his coupon book, his hand trembling slightly. "I cannot live on suspicion," he said, his voice thin but resolute. "If it is a trick, I will be the first to know. If it is real, I will be the first to taste chocolate again." His declaration was met with a shocked silence. A few of the older men scoffed, but others looked on with a flicker of morbid curiosity. Haruto managed to convince a small group to accompany him, more as witnesses than participants. Among them, drawn by a force he could not name, was a reluctant Daichi Nakamura, with Kenji shadowing him like a worried ghost. They walked across the compound under the long evening shadows, their footsteps hesitant on the packed earth. The canteen was a small, plain wooden hut, no different from any other building in the camp, yet it felt like crossing a forbidden threshold. As they pushed the door open, a wave of unfamiliar scents washed over them, sweet and clean and utterly foreign. The small store was stocked with items they had not seen in years, things that belonged to a forgotten world of peace and plenty. There were bars of soap in colorful wrappers, stacks of glossy magazines with smiling American women on the covers, neat packs of cigarettes, and, most astonishingly, rows of bright, alluring candy bars. Behind the simple wooden counter, an American soldier sat on a stool, looking profoundly bored. He glanced up as they entered, his expression one of complete indifference. The Japanese prisoners stood frozen in the doorway, gawking like children at a festival stall. It was Haruto who finally moved. He shuffled forward, his wooden clogs making a soft scraping sound on the floorboards. He pointed a trembling finger at a bar of chocolate, its wrapper a brilliant, impossible red. The American soldier followed his gaze, took the indicated coupon book from Haruto's outstretched hand, and with a practiced motion, tore out a small slip of paper. He then slid the chocolate bar across the counter. The transaction was so simple, so mundane. It was surreal. Haruto picked it up as if it might explode. He fumbled with the wrapper, his fingers clumsy. He tore it open and took a bite, a large, desperate bite. His eyes, already wide, grew wider still. A muffled sound, half sob, half exclamation, escaped his full mouth. He turned to the others, his face a study in pure, unadulterated shock. "It's real," he managed to say, crumbs tumbling from his lips. "Nakamura-san, it's real chocolate." The spell was broken. A few other men, emboldened by Haruto's success, shuffled forward to make their own hesitant purchases. Daiichi watched them, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The soldier's boredom, the simple exchange, the look on Haruto's face, it all chipped away at the wall of his skepticism. This was not an elaborate trap. It was just a store. Cautiously, he stepped forward and used one of his own coupons to buy a pack of American cigarettes. He stepped back outside into the cool evening air, the other men watching him intently. He tapped one of the white cylinders from the pack, placed it between his lips, and lit it with a borrowed match. He took a long, deep drag. The smoke was sharp, different from the harsh tobacco he was used to, but it was undeniably real. It filled his lungs with a strange, foreign warmth. As he exhaled, watching the smoke curl and dissipate into the twilight, he felt a confusing mix of emotions. There was relief, a primal acknowledgement that this small pleasure was not poisoned. There was guilt, a voice in his head that whispered of betrayal and weakness, and beneath it all, there was a deep, unsettling curiosity. The simple, mundane act of a transaction, of exchanging his labor for a small, fleeting luxury, was a profound psychological event. The taste of the foreign tobacco was the taste of a bewildering new reality, a reality where the enemy paid you for your work, and the greatest immediate threat was not a bayonet, but a choice between a comic book and a candy bar. The wage system, once a source of unified suspicion, quickly became a schism that split the prisoner population down the middle. The simple act of buying a bar of soap created a rift in the barracks, a divide between two irreconcilable philosophies. On one side were the hardline imperial loyalists, a faction of men who clung to the rigid code of Bushido as their only remaining anchor in a world turned upside down. Their unofficial leader was Lieutenant Tanaka, a senior officer whose sharp features and perpetually narrowed eyes gave him an air of severe, unbending authority. Before his capture, he had been a company commander, a man accustomed to obedience and ideological purity. Here, stripped of his rank and sword, he wielded his zealotry like a weapon. He declared that accepting payment from the enemy, even in the form of canteen scrip, was a form of collaboration. It was a betrayal of the emperor, a stain on their collective honor. He and his followers refused to work for pay, and they publicly shamed those who did, their voices dripping with contempt. On the other side were the pragmatists, a growing number of men who saw the wages not as a moral compromise, but as a simple tool for survival. Their informal spokesman was Haruto, whose initial act of daring had made him a reluctant leader. They argued that honor was an abstract concept for the battlefield, not the prison yard. Here, an extra bar of soap could prevent sickness, a warmer pair of socks could ward off the frost, and a piece of chocolate could provide a desperately needed surge of energy and morale. Daiichi found himself caught in the turbulent waters between these two currents. His ingrained sense of duty, the years of military indoctrination, pulled him toward Tanaka's unyielding stance. The shame of his capture was a physical weight, and the idea of profiting from it felt deeply wrong. Yet, the undeniable logic of the situation, the simple, human desire for a small measure of comfort and control, drew him toward Haruto's pragmatism. The barracks became a microcosm of their internal conflict. At night, the long wooden building was a space of palpable tension. Tanaka would hold impromptu lectures, his voice cutting through the weary silence. He would speak of sacrifice, of the glory of death, of the shame of their present condition. He and his followers would sit in rigid meditation for hours, their faces masks of stoic denial, refusing any and all goods from the canteen as if they were poison. Meanwhile, on the other side of the room, men would be quietly enjoying their purchases. They would write letters home on paper bought with their scrip, letters they knew would likely never be delivered but wrote anyway as an act of hope. They would mend their clothes with purchased needles and thread, or simply sit on their bunks, savoring a piece of candy, the small sweetness a defiant counterpoint to the bitterness of their existence. One evening, as Daiichi was mending a tear in his shirt, Tanaka confronted him directly. The lieutenant stood over him, his shadow falling across Daiichi's bunk. "Petty officer," Tanaka began, his voice low and sharp with contempt. "You were a credit to your uniform. I remember your record. Now you sell your honor for cigarettes and trinkets. You shame your ancestors." Daiichi slowly looked up, meeting the lieutenant's burning gaze. He felt a surge of defiance, a feeling that surprised him. "With respect, Lieutenant," he replied, his own voice steady. "My ancestors valued survival. We are prisoners. We are not on the battlefield. Our bodies are all we have left to command, and keeping them strong is its own form of honor." Tanaka sneered. "You sound like them. You're starting to think like an American." He turned and walked away, his back ramrod straight, leaving a chill in the air. Later that night, as Daiichi lay on his cot staring into the darkness, Haruto spoke to him from the neighboring bunk. "Do not let him trouble you, Nakamura-san," the young man whispered. "Tanaka speaks of honor, but his words are cold. A bar of chocolate is warm. It reminds my body that I'm still alive. Is that a crime?" Daiichi did not answer, but Haruto's words echoed in his mind. He was torn between the powerful familiar ideology of Tanaka, a code that had defined his entire life, and the simple human pragmatism of Haruto. He began to truly question the absolute nature of the Bushido code for the first time. What did honor mean here, in this strange, inverted world where the enemy did not want to kill you, but to pay you? The barracks with Tanaka's rigid followers clustered on one side and the men embracing small comforts on the other was a physical map of the war being waged inside his own soul. In the quiet moments after work or before sleep, Daiichi had taken up a habit from his childhood. He would find scraps of wood, discarded branches or bits of lumber, and carve them with a sharpened stone he kept hidden in his bedding. It was a way to focus his mind, to channel his restless energy into something creative. He carved small, intricate figures, his hands remembering motions his mind had long forgotten. He was not a master carver, but his work had a certain life to it. He carved soldiers and sailors at first, figures from his old life, but they felt hollow, ghosts of a world that no longer existed. His quiet pastime did not go unnoticed. Corporal Henderson, the young guard who had shown the men how to properly use a shovel, would often pass by the barracks in the evenings. He never stopped, never spoke, but Daiichi sometimes felt the American's eyes on him as he worked the wood. One afternoon, returning from a grueling day of clearing stumps, Daiichi found 2 items lying neatly on his bunk, placed directly on his folded blanket. One was a small, clean block of high-quality pine wood, its grain straight and pale. The other was a small proper carving knife with a worn wooden handle and a blade that glinted in the dim light. There was no note. No one had seen who left them. But Daiichi knew. He was immediately and deeply suspicious. He did not touch the items for a full day. He stared at them, his mind racing. It was another trick, another test. Kenji, ever the voice of caution, confirmed his fears. "It is a trap, Daiichi," his friend whispered, his eyes wide. "He will claim you stole them, or he will ask for a favor, something that will truly dishonor you. Do not touch them." Daiichi listened to Kenji's warnings, but the pull of the beautiful, fragrant wood was too strong. The smooth, unblemished surface promised a kind of perfection that was absent from every other part of his life. On the second day, he could resist no longer. He picked up the block of pine. It felt warm and solid in his hands. He opened the knife. The blade was sharp, honed to a fine edge. He sat on his bunk and, with a deep breath, made the first cut. He did not carve a warrior or a battleship. Instead, an image from an old scroll painting came to his mind. He began to carve a crane, the sacred bird of longevity and hope, its long neck arched, its wings poised for flight. The work absorbed him completely. The soft rasp of the blade against the wood, the satisfying curl of the shavings that fell away, the slow emergence of a graceful form from the rough block. It was all a kind of therapy. It was a way to process the chaos in his mind, to carve out a new understanding of his world. A few days later, Corporal Henderson walked past as Daiichi was putting the finishing touches on the crane's delicate feathers. The guard slowed his pace, his eyes falling on the nearly completed figure in Daiichi's hands. He did not stop, but as he passed, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of approval. "My grandfather carves ducks," Henderson said, his voice quiet, not breaking his stride. "You're good." And then he was gone. The simple, offhand compliment, the shared connection over a common craft, struck Daiichi with more force than any institutional policy or official announcement. The wage system was a policy, an article of a convention. This was different. This was personal. It was a human connection, a gesture of kindness from one man to another, stripped of uniforms and ideologies. It forced him to see Henderson not as a guard, not as a symbol of his enemy, but as a person, a young man whose grandfather carved ducks. Kenji remained wary. "What does he want from you?" he asked later, watching Daiichi sand the crane with a rough piece of cloth. "He will ask for something in return. No one gives a gift for nothing." Daiichi looked down at the smooth, elegant lines of the wooden bird in his hands. He thought of the young American's quiet words of praise. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Perhaps, Kenji. Perhaps he wants nothing." It was a thought so radical, so contrary to his entire experience of the world, that it felt like a revelation. The crane, a symbol of hope, was becoming something more. It was a testament to a moment of unexpected grace, a tangible link to a man he was supposed to hate, and a quiet acknowledgement that even here, in the heart of his captivity, a new and unfamiliar kind of honor might just be possible. The abstract debates of the barracks, the philosophical arguments over honor and shame, were rendered meaningless by a force that had no ideology, the brutal, uncompromising breath of a Wisconsin winter. It descended upon Camp McCoy not gradually, but like an invading army, a relentless siege of white and gray. The sky turned to lead, and the snow began to fall, thick and heavy, burying the camp in a silent, suffocating blanket. A wind with teeth of ice howled through the cracks in the wooden barracks, a constant predatory sound that gnawed at the men's spirits. With the cold came sickness, a virulent strain of influenza, what the Americans called the flu, swept through the camp like a phantom menace. It started with a cough in one barracks, a fever in another, and within a week, the infirmary was overwhelmed. The small building, designed to handle injuries and minor ailments, became a chorus of misery, filled with the sounds of hacking coughs, pained groans, and the shallow, rattling breaths of men struggling for air. Lieutenant Tanaka, the self-appointed guardian of their imperial honor, was among the first to fall gravely ill. His rigid ideology, which had sustained his spirit, had left his body vulnerable. While others had used their canteen script to buy thicker socks, sweaters, or high-energy foods like chocolate and condensed milk to supplement their rations, Tanaka and his followers had subsisted on the bare minimum. They saw it as a purification, a way to keep their souls untainted by American comforts. But a soul, however pure, could not fight a fever. Now, Tanaka lay on a cot in the crowded infirmary, his body racked with violent shivers that seemed to shake the very frame of the bed. His face, usually a mask of stern authority, was pale and slick with sweat, his eyes glassy and unfocused as he muttered deliriously in Japanese. His pride had become his funeral shroud. Daiichi, assigned to a work detail helping in the infirmary, saw the tragic, self-defeating conclusion of Tanaka's unbending code laid bare. He watched as the camp doctor, a weary man with dark circles under his eyes, worked tirelessly, moving from cot to cot, his resources stretched to the breaking point. The doctor stopped by Tanaka's bed, placing a hand on the lieutenant's forehead. He shook his head, his expression grim. He spoke to a young orderly, his voice low and strained. "His fever is dangerously high," the doctor said, his words audible to Daiichi over the din of coughing. "We need to keep him warm, but we're out of spare blankets. The next supply shipment is 3 days away if the snow doesn't block the roads." Haruto, who was also helping, stood beside Daiichi, his face a mixture of pity and righteous anger. He looked at the shivering form of the lieutenant, the man who had called him weak, who had accused him of selling his honor for a piece of candy. "Look at him," Haruto whispered, his voice tight with emotion. "He is dying for an idea that cannot keep him warm." Daiichi said nothing, but the words struck him with the force of a physical blow. The cold in the infirmary was more than just a temperature. It was a metaphor for the unforgiving nature of Tanaka's ideology, a philosophy that offered no warmth, no comfort, no room for the simple, messy business of staying alive. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and sickness, but all Daiichi could see was Tanaka's face, a man defeated not by the enemy, but by his own suffocating pride. He was a soldier, entombed by his own code. That evening, Daiichi Nakamura made a decision. The endless internal debate, the war between duty and pragmatism, finally resolved itself into a single clear course of action. During the evening meal, as most of the several hundred prisoners were gathered in the main mess hall, their weary silence punctuated only by the scrape of spoons against metal trays, he stood up. He walked to the center of the long, noisy room, stepped onto an empty bench, and waited. Slowly, the noise subsided as men turned to look at him, their faces curious, expectant. Daiichi took a deep breath, the smell of boiled potatoes and weak tea filling his lungs. "We have argued," he began, his voice clear and steady, projecting across the hall. "We have argued for months about what it means to have honor. We have drawn lines between us, between those who work for the enemy's paper and those who do not." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the faces before him, from Tanaka's stern, disapproving followers to the men who clutched their coupon books like a lifeline. "Tonight, in the infirmary, Lieutenant Tanaka and many others are fighting for their lives. The doctor has no more blankets. The cold is a worse enemy than any American guard. They are dying, and we are arguing." A hardliner loyal to Tanaka, a man named Goto, scoffed loudly from his table. "He called us dogs for working, for taking their money. Why should we help him? Let his honor keep him warm." A murmur of agreement rippled through a section of the room. Daiichi's gaze found Goto, and he held it. "Because we are not him," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "Because our honor is not so brittle that it breaks when we choose to save a comrade's life. This enemy money," he held up his own worn coupon book, "this paper can buy warmth. It can buy another day of life. If using it is a dishonor, then it is a dishonor I will gladly accept for the life of a fellow Japanese." There was a moment of stunned, absolute silence. The challenge hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Then, a figure rose from a nearby table. It was Haruto. He walked forward without a word, his expression resolute, and placed his own coupon book on the bench at Daiichi's feet. A second later, Kenji, his face a mixture of fear and loyalty, did the same. It was like the breaking of a dam. One by one, then in pairs, then in dozens, men rose from their benches and came forward. They placed their books of scrip on the bench, creating a large, colorful pile of paper, a mountain of accumulated labor and small, hoarded luxuries. They were no longer factions. They were a community. They marched, a silent, determined procession from the mess hall to the canteen. The American soldier on duty, the same bored young man from before, looked up from his magazine, his jaw dropping in astonishment as nearly 200 Japanese prisoners filed into his small store. Daiichi, at the head of the group, spoke to the translator they had brought with them. "We want to buy everything," he said simply. "Every blanket, every sweater, every pair of socks, all the chocolate, all the condensed milk, all the coffee." The soldier, utterly bewildered, could only nod and begin stacking items on the counter as the prisoners pooled their scrip, a fortune in canteen currency. They bought out nearly the entire stock of useful goods. The men emerged from the hut laden with supplies, a strange army armed with wool and chocolate. Daiichi himself carried a new thick wool blanket, still smelling of the factory. He walked directly to the infirmary, the cold air biting at his face, and went to Tanaka's cot. The lieutenant was still shivering, his breathing shallow. Without a word, Daiichi unfolded the heavy blanket and gently laid it over Tanaka's trembling body, tucking it in around his shoulders. It was not an act of forgiveness nor of pity. It was an act of life. In that moment, Daiichi understood that he had not betrayed his honor. He had redefined it. It was not a rigid, death-seeking code. It was a compassionate, life-affirming act of community, a choice to bend so that they would not break. The canteen buyout marked a turning point, a thaw in the frozen landscape of their captivity. Thanks to the pooled resources, the extra warmth and nourishment, the tide of the influenza outbreak began to recede. Lieutenant Tanaka survived. So did most of the other men who had fallen gravely ill. The crisis had forged a new sense of unity among the prisoners, melting the rigid ideological divisions that had separated them. Tanaka, upon his recovery, was a changed man. He was humbled, the sharp edges of his zealous pride worn smooth by his brush with death. He never offered a formal apology to Daiichi or the others he had condemned. The words would not pass his lips, but his actions spoke volumes. He would nod respectfully when he passed Daiichi in the compound, a gesture of profound, unspoken gratitude. The barracks was no longer a space of tension, but of quiet cooperation. Months passed. The snows of winter melted, giving way to the tender green of a Wisconsin spring. The work continued, but the atmosphere in the camp had fundamentally shifted. Then, one day in late summer, the news arrived, spreading through the camp like wildfire. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The prisoners were told they would be repatriated, sent home. The reaction was a complex mixture of shock, relief, and a deep, unsettling uncertainty. They were going home. But to what? To a defeated nation, a world they no longer recognized. On the day of their departure, as they gathered their meager belongings, Captain Albright and Corporal Henderson came to the barracks. Albright, his posture as formal as ever, stood before the assembled men. "The war is over," he said, his words relayed by the translator. "You men came here as enemies. You worked, you earned, and you survived. Go home and help build a new Japan." It was a short, simple speech, devoid of sentiment, but it carried the weight of history. As the men began to file out, Henderson found Daiichi in the crowd. The young American guard, who had seemed so boyish, now looked older, his face etched with the gravity of the moment. He was holding something in his hand. It was the wooden crane, sanded to a smooth, lustrous finish, its lines graceful and perfect. Daiichi had given it to him as a gift months ago, a silent thank you for the carving knife. Henderson had kept it safe for him. "A souvenir," Henderson said, pressing the wooden bird into Daiichi's hand. "So you remember that. Not all of it was a fight." He offered a small, sad smile, and to Daiichi's surprise, extended his hand. Daiichi looked at the offered hand for a moment, then grasped it firmly. The handshake was brief, but it was a connection that transcended language and war. As they parted, Tanaka approached Daiichi, his gaze direct and clear for the first time. "You did not let my pride be the end of me, Nakamura," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Thank you. It was all he said, but it was enough. The story ends with Daiichi Nakamura on the deck of a transport ship, heading west across the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific. He is no longer a captive, but a survivor. The sun is setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He stands at the railing, the sea breeze cool on his face, holding the smooth wooden crane in his hand. Its familiar form is a tangible link to an unexpected moment of human connection. A reminder of a young man whose grandfather carved ducks. He looks out at the horizon towards a home he now feels is both strange and familiar, and a future he never could have imagined. He understands now. The coupons, the 80 cents a day, they were not a trick or an insult. They were a lesson. They were the first crack in a wall of hatred, the first seed of a new idea. They were a simple, revolutionary acknowledgement that even a prisoner, even an enemy, was a man whose work had value. He was going home not with the crushing shame of a defeated warrior, but with the quiet, hard-won wisdom of a man who had learned that true honor was not about how a soldier chooses to die, but about how a man chooses to live.